No magic could wake the sleeping dragon prince, until a human stable boy whispered, "Get up, lazy." Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. In the shadow of Mount Calidor, nestled between ancient pines and crystal-clear lakes, the kingdom of Draconia was facing its darkest hour. The heir to the throne, Prince Acheron, lay in an enchanted slumber that had lasted 1,000 days, and no spell, charm, or enchantment had been able to rouse him from his mysterious sleep. The Draconian palace loomed majestically against the skyline, its 7 spires reaching toward the heavens, each crowned with gleaming crystals that changed color with the moods of the royal family. Today, all 7 crystals glowed a somber blue, reflecting the melancholy that had descended upon the kingdom since the prince had fallen into his unnatural slumber. Inside the palace's grand eastern tower, the royal bedchamber, was a flurry of activity. Mages from all corners of the realm had gathered at the summons of King Thoraxis, each bearing tomes, potions, and artifacts of immense power. The air crackled with potent energies as spell after spell was cast, yet the sleeping prince remained motionless beneath silken sheets of deepest midnight blue. Prince Acheron was no ordinary heir. As a dragon shifter, he possessed the ability to transform between humanoid and dragon forms at will, a gift that had made the royal lineage of Draconia legendary throughout the ages. In his humanoid form, he appeared as a tall, regal figure with scales of shimmering sapphire adorning his temples, forearms, and spine. His eyes, when open, were the color of molten gold, and his hair was a cascade of silver that reflected the light like polished metal. But for 1,000 days, those golden eyes had remained closed, and the prince's usually vibrant scales had dulled to a matte navy. His chest rose and fell in slow, even breaths, but no amount of shaking, shouting, or magical intervention had been able to break through whatever dream held him captive. King Thoraxis paced the length of the chamber, his clawed feet clicking against the marble floor. Unlike his son, the king preferred to remain in his half-dragon form at all times, a sign of strength and authority among his people. His scales were a deep crimson that darkened to black along his spine, and his eyes glowed like embers in the dim light of the bedchamber. "Nothing," hissed the king, smoke curling from his nostrils in frustration. 3 years of the finest magical minds in the realm, and still my son sleeps." Grand Mage Xylorin, a venerable dragonborn who had served the royal family for 7 generations, bowed his head in defeat. "The enchantment grows stronger with each passing day, Your Majesty. It feeds upon our magic, turning our efforts against us. I fear that conventional sorcery may never be enough to break this curse." The king turned to the assembled mages, each more powerful than the last, each having failed to wake the prince. "Is there truly nothing more we can try? No forgotten spell, no ancient artifact, no ritual we have overlooked?" The mages exchanged uneasy glances, none willing to admit defeat, yet none offering a solution. From the back of the room, a voice spoke up, soft yet unwavering. "There is one possibility we have not yet explored, Your Majesty." All eyes turned to Lady Vespera, the keeper of forbidden knowledge and the youngest member of the royal council. Her scales were the color of amethyst, and her eyes held wisdom far beyond her years. "Speak, Lady Vespera," commanded the king. "The prophecy of the mundane touch," she said, unrolling an ancient scroll covered in runes that seemed to shift and change as they were read. "It speaks of a time when dragon magic will fail, and only the simplest of gestures from the most unlikely of sources will succeed where great power has failed." King Thoraxis narrowed his eyes. "You speak of humans." The word hung in the air, met with scoffs and mutters of disbelief from the assembled mages. Humans were rare in Draconia, tolerated but hardly respected. They possessed no innate magic, could not communicate telepathically as many other species could, and their lifespans were painfully brief by Draconian standards. What could a human possibly achieve that the greatest Draconian mages could not? "I do, Your Majesty," Lady Vespera confirmed. "The prophecy states that when scales of midnight dull and eyes of gold are hidden, seek not the power of ancients, but the touch of those who burn bright and brief, For in simplicity lies the key that magic cannot forge. King Thoraxis growled, a sound that made the crystals in the chandelier above tremble. You would have me place the fate of my son, the future of our kingdom, in the hands of humans? I would have you try all options, my king, Lady Vespera replied calmly. 3 years have passed, and Prince Acheron still slumbers. What harm could there be in allowing humans to approach him? If they fail, we have lost nothing but time. The king's tail lashed against the floor, leaving scorch marks on the marble. After a long moment of tense silence, he nodded once. Very well. Send word to the human settlements. Any who wish to try may do so. But, he added, raising a clawed finger, they must understand the gravity of this situation. False hope is a poison I will not tolerate. Lady Vespera bowed deeply. As you command, Your Majesty. I shall make the arrangements immediately. Word spread quickly throughout Draconia and beyond its borders. Humans from all walks of life journeyed to the royal palace, each hoping to be the one to wake the sleeping prince. Some came seeking glory, others seeking reward, and still others out of genuine concern for the well-being of the realm. One by one, they were ushered into the prince's chamber. They tried everything from gentle touches to impassioned pleas, from singing lullabies to reciting poetry. Some brought offerings of food or drink, others performed elaborate dances or played instruments. A few even attempted to shock the prince awake with loud noises or startling actions. None succeeded. Prince Acheron slumbered on, oblivious to the parade of humans who came and went from his bedchamber. As the weeks passed, the king's hope began to wane once more. This was a fool's errand, he told Lady Vespera as they watched yet another dejected human leave the palace. The prophecy is nothing but empty words. Perhaps we have not yet found the right human, Lady Vespera suggested. The prophecy speaks of simplicity, yet many who have tried have done so with complexity and fanfare. The king sighed, a sound like distant thunder. How many more must we endure before accepting that this path leads nowhere? Just a few more days, my king, Lady Vespera pleaded. I feel that the answer is close at hand. Reluctantly, the king agreed to continue the human visitations for 1 more week. If the prince did not wake by then, they would seek other solutions. In the royal stables, far from the opulence of the palace, worked a young human named Mason Drake. At 20 summers, he was neither particularly tall nor remarkably strong, with tousled brown hair that never seemed to lie flat and eyes the color of freshly turned earth. What he lacked in stature or striking features, however, he made up for in diligence and an almost supernatural ability to communicate with the animals in his care. Mason had come to Draconia 5 years earlier, a refugee from the human kingdoms across the eastern sea where a devastating plague had claimed the lives of his parents and younger sister. With nowhere else to go and no other skills to offer, he had taken a position as a stable hand in the royal stables, tending to the magnificent creatures that the dragon nobles used for both transportation and status. The royal stables housed everything from mundane horses to exotic griffins and hippogriffs, as well as several smaller dragon breeds that served as messengers and companions to the nobility. Mason's particular charges were the royal wyverns, distant cousins to true dragons, with 2 legs rather than 4 and a poisonous stinger at the tip of their tails. Mason had little interest in the comings and goings of nobility. He kept to himself, did his work without complaint, and found contentment in the simple routine of caring for his charges. He had heard rumors of the sleeping prince. Of course, such news was impossible to avoid, even in the stables, but he considered it a problem for mages and royalty, not for a stable boy with dirt beneath his fingernails and straw in his hair. That changed on the 523rd day of the human visitations, when one of the royal wyverns fell ill. The wyvern was Starfire, a magnificent specimen with scales of burnished gold and a particular favorite of Prince Acheron before his enchanted sleep. The beast had grown listless and refused to eat, its usually bright eyes dulled with pain. The royal veterinarians had tried everything within their considerable power to heal the creature, but nothing had worked. As days passed, Starfire's condition worsened until it seemed certain that the wyvern would not survive the week. It is as if he has lost the will to live, the head veterinarian told Mason sadly. Perhaps he misses his master too keenly. Mason spent every waking moment with the suffering wyvern, speaking to it softly, coaxing it to take small sips of water, applying poultices to ease its discomfort. One evening, as he sat beside the creature in the dim light of the stable lanterns, an idea struck him. Perhaps, he murmured to Starfire, stroking the wyvern's snout gently, you need to hear from your master directly. The next morning, Mason approached the palace guards with a request that even to his own ears sounded absurd. He wished to bring the ailing wyvern to see Prince Acheron. The beast is dying, he explained to the skeptical guards. It has served the prince faithfully for years. Surely it deserves the chance to see him one last time. The guards were unmoved by his plea, but fate intervened in the form of Lady Vespera, who happened to be passing by on her way to the royal library. What seems to be the problem here? She inquired, her violet eyes curious. Mason repeated his request, adding, I know it sounds foolish, my lady, but Starfire is fading fast. I believe that being near the prince might provide some comfort in his final hours. Lady Vespera studied the human stable boy thoughtfully. Unlike many of her kind, she held no prejudice against humans. In fact, she found them fascinating. Their brief lives burned so brightly, filled with an intensity and urgency that the long-lived draconians often lacked. Not foolish at all, she decided. Wyverns form deep bonds with their riders. Your request is granted, stable boy. You may bring Starfire to the prince's chamber at sunset, when the corridors will be less crowded. Mason bowed deeply, gratitude evident in every line of his body. Thank you, my lady. You are most kind. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the palace grounds, Mason led Starfire slowly through seldom-used corridors, guided by a servant sent by Lady Vespera. The wyvern was so weak that the journey, which would normally have taken mere minutes, stretched to nearly an hour. By the time they reached the prince's chamber, Starfire was trembling with exhaustion, and Mason feared he had made a terrible mistake in moving the creature at all. The guards outside the prince's door eyed the wyvern warily, but, having been informed of Lady Vespera's permission, allowed Mason and Starfire to enter. The chamber was empty save for the sleeping prince, the evening shift of mages and healers not yet arrived. Prince Acheron lay as he had for 1,523 days, perfectly still, his chest rising and falling in the same slow rhythm, his dulled scales catching what little light filtered through the heavy curtains. Mason guided Starfire to the bedside, supporting the wyvern's weight as best he could. The creature let out a soft keen of recognition, straining forward to nuzzle the prince's limp hand. There now, Mason murmured, his heart breaking at the sight. You see, he is still here. He has not abandoned you. Starfire made another sound, part whine, part growl, and nudged the prince's hand more insistently. When there was no response, the wyvern's head drooped in defeat. Do not give up so easily, Mason told the wyvern, frustration creeping into his voice. He looked at the sleeping prince, so peaceful while his kingdom suffered and loyal creatures like Starfire wasted away from grief. Without thinking, Mason did something that would have earned him a severe punishment, perhaps even execution, had any of the royal guards or mages been present. He reached out and shook the prince's shoulder. Your Highness, he said firmly, your wyvern needs you. The prince did not stir. Mason frowned. He had seen hundreds of humans enter and leave this chamber, each attempting increasingly elaborate methods to wake the slumbering royal. None had succeeded. Looking at Starfire's dejected form, Mason felt a surge of anger on behalf of the loyal creature. 3 years of enchanted sleep was one thing for the prince, but for those who loved and depended on him, it had been 3 years of grief and uncertainty. Acting on impulse rather than reason, Mason leaned closer to the prince and said in the same tone he used to rouse lazy stable hands on winter mornings, Get up, lazy. Your wyvern is dying, and you are sleeping the day away like some pampered house cat. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, so subtly that Mason almost missed it, the prince's eyelids flickered. Mason blinked, certain he had imagined it. But no, there it was again, a definite movement. Hardly daring to breathe, Mason watched as Prince Acheron's eyes slowly, impossibly, opened for the first time in over 3 years. The prince's golden gaze was unfocused at first, drifting aimlessly around the room before settling on Mason's face. His brow furrowed in confusion. "Who?" he croaked, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Are you?" Before Mason could answer, Starfire let out a joyous cry that seemed to shake the very foundations of the palace. The wyvern lunged forward with renewed strength, nearly knocking Mason over in its eagerness to reach its now-awake master. Prince Acheron's confusion gave way to delight as he recognized his beloved companion. "Starfire," he whispered, reaching out to stroke the wyvern's snout. "My old friend." The door to the chamber burst open as guards and mages rushed in, drawn by the wyvern's cry. For a moment, there was absolute stillness as they beheld the impossible. Prince Acheron sitting upright in bed, fully awake, with Starfire's head resting contentedly in his lap. Then chaos erupted. Some of the mages fell to their knees in shock. Others ran to fetch the king, and the guards seemed uncertain whether to celebrate or arrest the human stable boy who stood frozen beside the bed. In the midst of the commotion, Prince Acheron raised a hand, and immediate silence fell. Despite his obvious weakness, the authority in that simple gesture was unmistakable. "This human," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "What is your name?" Mason swallowed hard. "Mason Drake, your highness. I am a stable boy." The prince's golden eyes studied him intently. "And it was you who woke me?" I believe so, your highness," Mason admitted, suddenly aware of the precariousness of his situation. "I spoke out of turn. Starfire was ill, and I was frustrated, and I told you to get up." A ripple of shock ran through the assembled draconians at this admission. To speak so disrespectfully to royalty was unheard of, particularly from a human. To everyone's astonishment, Prince Acheron laughed, a rusty sound that nonetheless filled the chamber with warmth. "How remarkable," he said, shaking his head in wonder. 3 years of the most powerful magic in the realm, and all it took was a stable boy telling me to get up. Mason could not help but smile in return, relief washing over him. "In my defense, your highness, you have been quite lazy. 1,523 days is an excessively long nap, even for royalty." This boldness drew gasps from the guards and mages, but the prince only laughed harder. "I like you, Mason Drake," he declared. "You speak plainly where others would couch their words in flattery and fear." Before Mason could respond, the chamber doors flew open once more, and King Thoraxis entered with such speed that his claws left gouges in the marble floor. He froze at the sight of his son sitting up in bed, awake and laughing. "Acheron," the king breathed, smoke curling from his nostrils in his emotional state. "My son." "Father," the prince replied, his expression softening. "I am told I have been asleep for quite some time." The king crossed the room in 3 great strides and embraced his son with a ferocity that would have crushed a being of lesser strength. 3 years, 4 months, and 13 days, he growled, his voice thick with emotion. "We thought we had lost you forever." As father and son reunited, Lady Vespera entered the chamber, her violet eyes immediately finding Mason where he stood awkwardly to one side. She glided to his side, a small smile playing about her lips. "It seems the prophecy was correct after all," she murmured. "The simplicity of a human stable boy succeeded where all our magic failed. How did you do it, Mason Drake? What great insight led you to the solution that eluded our finest minds?" Mason shook his head, embarrassed. "There was no insight, my lady. I was concerned for Starfire and annoyed at the prince for sleeping while his wyvern suffered. I spoke without thinking." Lady Vespera's smile widened. "Perhaps that is precisely why you succeeded. You acted from genuine emotion rather than calculation. You spoke as one being to another, not as a subject to a prince." Before Mason could reply, King Thoraxis's voice rang out, commanding attention. "Who is responsible for this miracle? Who has awakened my son?" All eyes turned to Mason, who suddenly wished the ground would open up and swallow him whole. He had never been comfortable as the center of attention, and now the most powerful being in the realm was staring at him with eyes that glowed like the heart of a forge. "This human stable boy, father," Prince Acheron said before anyone else could speak. "Mason Drake. He did what all your mages could not." King Thoraxis regarded Mason with an intensity that made the human want to flee. "Approach, human," the king commanded. On legs that threatened to buckle at any moment, Mason walked forward and knelt before the royal bed. "Your Majesty," he said, keeping his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. "Look at me, Mason Drake," the king ordered. Mason raised his gaze, meeting the king's fiery eyes with as much composure as he could muster. "How did you break the enchantment?" the king demanded. "What power do you possess that my most skilled mages do not?" "None, Your Majesty," Mason replied honestly. "I possess no power at all. I merely spoke to the prince as I would speak to anyone who was neglecting their duty." "He called me lazy," Prince Acheron added, amusement clear in his voice, "and told me to get up." King Thraxus's expression was unreadable for a long moment. Then, to Mason's immense relief, he began to laugh, a deep, rumbling sound like distant avalanches. "By the ancient flames," the king roared, "it is too absurd to be anything but true. 3 years of our greatest sorcery, and my son is awakened by a human stable boy calling him lazy." The tension in the room dissipated like morning mist, replaced by an atmosphere of jubilation. Even the most haughty of the dragon nobles could not help but join in the king's laughter. As celebrations began in earnest, messengers dispatched to spread the joyous news throughout the kingdom, servants rushing to prepare a feast worthy of the occasion. Mason found himself somewhat forgotten in the excitement. This suited him perfectly. He slipped to Starfire's side, checking the wyvern's condition with practiced hands. To his amazement, the creature showed signs of rapid recovery. Its eyes were bright once more, its breathing strong and even. The joy of seeing its master awake had seemingly cured whatever ailment had plagued it. "You truly care for him," observed a voice at Mason's shoulder. He turned to find Prince Acheron standing beside him, somewhat unsteady on his feet after so long abed, but determined to stand nonetheless. "Your Highness," Mason said, startled. "You should be resting." The prince waved away his concern. "I have rested quite enough, I think. And you have not answered my observation." Mason returned his attention to Starfire, adjusting the wyvern's harness for better comfort. "Of course I care for him. That is my job. Many perform their jobs adequately without true care," the prince countered. "You went beyond duty to bring a dying wyvern to see its master one last time. That speaks of genuine compassion." Mason shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "The creatures in my care cannot speak for themselves. Someone must advocate for their needs." Prince Acheron studied him thoughtfully. "How long have you worked in the royal stables, Mason Drake?" 5 years, Your Highness." "And in that time, have you ever been inside the palace before today?" Mason shook his head. "No, Your Highness. My place is with the animals." The prince frowned. "That seems a waste. You clearly possess qualities beyond those required for stable work. Intelligence, compassion, courage, these are traits I value highly." Before Mason could respond, the prince swayed slightly on his feet. Without thinking, Mason reached out to steady him, only realizing after he had done so that he had laid hands on royalty for the second time that day, an action that could be considered a serious offense. To his relief, Prince Acheron did not seem offended. "My body appears to have forgotten how to stand properly," he said with a wry smile. "Would you be so kind as to help me back to my bed? I find I am not quite as recovered as I had hoped." Mason carefully supported the prince as they made their way back to the royal bed. As he helped the prince sit, Acheron fixed him with those penetrating golden eyes once more. "I am in your debt, Mason Drake," he said seriously. "Not just for waking me, but for caring for Starfire when I could not. Name your reward, and if it is within my power to grant, it shall be yours." Mason blinked, taken aback by the offer. He had not expected any reward, nor did he particularly want one. What use would gold or jewels be to him? His needs were simple: a roof over his head, food in his belly, and the satisfaction of work well done. "Your Highness is very generous," he said carefully, "but I require no reward. I am content with my position in the stables." Prince Acheron's expression suggested he did not believe this for a moment. "Everyone desires something, Mason Drake. If not wealth or power, then perhaps knowledge, opportunity, a boon for someone dear to you." Mason hesitated. There was one thing he had always longed for, though he had never dared to voice it aloud. "There is one thing, Your Highness." though I fear it may be too presumptuous. Speak freely, the prince encouraged. You have earned that right, at least. I have always wished to learn, Mason admitted. Not just about horses and wyverns, though I love that work dearly, but about everything. History, science, magic, even though I cannot perform it myself. The Royal Library is said to contain the greatest collection of knowledge in the realm, yet it is closed to all but nobility and scholars. You wish for access to the Royal Library? The prince clarified, seeming surprised by the modest nature of the request. Mason nodded, embarrassed now that he had spoken the desire aloud. As I said, it is presumptuous. I understand if. Granted, the prince interrupted. But I think we can do better than mere access to the library. Before Mason could ask what the prince meant, King Thoraxis returned to the chamber, accompanied by his full council and several servants bearing trays of food and drink. The kingdom rejoices at your return to the waking world, my son, the king announced. A celebration unlike any Draconia has ever seen will commence at dawn tomorrow. But first, you must regain your strength. The royal physicians insist upon it. As servants bustled around the prince, arranging pillows and offering various elixirs and tonics, King Thoraxis turned his attention to Mason, who was doing his best to become invisible against the far wall. The human remains, the king observed, his tone neutral. Prince Acheron nodded. I have asked him to stay, father. I am not finished with our conversation. The king studied Mason with new interest. The prophecy spoke truly. In simplicity lies the key that magic cannot forge. Tell me, human, are you satisfied with your position in the royal stables? Mason glanced at Prince Acheron, who nodded encouragingly. The work suits me well, your majesty, though I have just confessed to your son that I harbor a desire for learning that extends beyond my current duties. Indeed, the king's eyebrows rose. Most humans would have asked for gold or land or titles. I have no use for such things, your majesty, Mason replied honestly. King Thoraxis exchanged a significant look with his son. You were right to be interested in this one, Acheron. He is unusual for his kind. I believe he could be valuable to us, father, the prince said. With your permission, I would like to appoint him as my personal attendant. Mason nearly choked on air. Personal attendant to the prince? It was a position usually reserved for noble-born draconians of impeccable lineage, not human stable boys with straw in their hair. Your Majesty, your Highness, he stammered. I am honored beyond words, but I know nothing of court protocol or the duties of an attendant. You can learn, the prince said simply. You expressed a desire for knowledge, did you not? Consider this a more comprehensive education than mere access to the library could provide. King Thoraxis stroked his scaled chin thoughtfully. It would be unprecedented. No human has ever served in such a capacity. All the more reason to try it, Prince Acheron argued. The old ways failed us, father. Perhaps it is time to explore new possibilities. After a moment's consideration, the king nodded. So be it. Mason Drake, you are hereby appointed personal attendant to Crown Prince Acheron of Draconia. Lady Vespera will oversee your training in court etiquette and protocol. Lady Vespera, who had been observing the exchange with evident interest, inclined her head. It would be my pleasure, your majesty. Mason struggled to process this sudden and dramatic change in his circumstances. Yesterday, he had been mucking out stalls and filling water troughs. Today, he had awakened a prince from an enchanted sleep and been elevated to one of the highest non-noble positions in the realm. Thank you, your majesty, he managed to say, bowing deeply. I will strive to be worthy of this honor. See that you do, the king rumbled, though there was no real threat in his tone. Now, I must return to managing the kingdom and preparing for tomorrow's celebration. Acheron, rest. Regain your strength. Your people are eager to see you restored to health. With that, the king swept from the room, his council trailing behind him like the tail of a comet. Prince Acheron sank back against his pillows with a sigh. Court formalities are exhausting at the best of times, he remarked to Mason. After 3 years asleep, they are positively draining. Mason smiled sympathetically. I imagine everything will be tiring for a while, your highness. Your body needs time to readjust. Wise words from a stable boy, the prince said with a small smile. Tell me, Mason Drake, are you frightened by this change in your circumstances? Mason considered the question carefully. Terrified might be a better word. Your Highness, I know nothing of court life. I will make mistakes. I will embarrass myself, and possibly you as well. Undoubtedly, the prince agreed cheerfully. But you will learn. And in the meantime, you will provide me with something I have sorely lacked: honesty. Everyone else treats me as if I might shatter at the slightest provocation. You called me lazy while I lay enchanted. Mason winced. In retrospect, that was extraordinarily rude. It was refreshing, the prince corrected him. And effective. I cannot promise that your new position will be easy, but I can promise that it will never be dull. As servants continued to fuss around the prince, Mason found himself ushered aside by Lady Vespera. Your life has changed rather dramatically in the space of an hour, she observed, her violet eyes keen. Yes, my lady, Mason agreed, still somewhat dazed by the turn of events. There will be those who resent your elevation, she warned him. Draconians who believe humans have no place in the palace, let alone at the prince's side. You would do well to tread carefully in the days ahead. Mason nodded, taking her warning seriously. I will do my best to learn quickly and give no cause for complaint. That may not be enough, Lady Vespera said frankly. But I believe you have more strength than you know, Mason Drake. You broke an enchantment that defied our greatest magical minds. There is power in that, even if it is not the kind we Draconians typically recognize. With that cryptic statement, she glided away, leaving Mason to wonder what exactly he had gotten himself into. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. As promised, Lady Vespera took charge of Mason's education in court etiquette, cramming months of training into intense daily sessions. He learned how to address various ranks of nobility, the proper way to serve at formal dinners, how to anticipate the prince's needs before they were voiced, and 1,000 other details that made his head spin. To his surprise, Mason found that he enjoyed the challenge. His quick mind absorbed the new information eagerly, and his natural dexterity made the physical aspects of his duties, such as helping the prince dress in the elaborate royal garments, easier than expected. Prince Ageron proved to be a patient and considerate master, never berating Mason for his inevitable mistakes, and often finding humor in situations that might have earned a severe reprimand from other nobles. The prince's recovery progressed rapidly, though the royal physicians insisted that he refrain from shifting to his dragon form until his strength was fully restored. This restriction chafed at the prince's patience, but he complied, focusing instead on rebuilding his physical endurance through daily exercises in the royal gardens. Mason accompanied him on these outings, ready to assist if needed, but mostly providing company. They talked of many things during these walks, the prince curious about Mason's life before coming to Draconia, and Mason equally curious about the prince's experiences and education. What do you remember of the enchantment? Mason asked one morning as they paused by a fountain shaped like a dragon in flight. Do you recall anything from your 3 years asleep? The prince frowned, trailing his fingers through the cool water. Dreams, he said after a moment. Endless dreams, like being trapped in a labyrinth of my own making. I could hear voices sometimes, calling to me from a great distance, but I could never find my way to them. It was lonely. Mason nodded sympathetically. And do you remember what happened before you fell asleep? How the enchantment came to be cast upon you? A shadow passed over the prince's face. That, I remember with perfect clarity. I was investigating reports of strange magic in the northern forests. There had been sightings of creatures not native to our realm, twisted things that seemed part animal, part shadow. I tracked them to their source, a portal hidden deep within the oldest part of the forest. The prince's golden eyes grew distant with memory. I should have returned to the palace for reinforcements, but I was young and overconfident. I approached the portal alone, thinking to close it with a binding spell I had recently mastered. But as I began the incantation, something reached through from the other side, a presence so ancient and cold that it froze the very air around me. He shuddered slightly. It spoke to me in a language I did not recognize, yet somehow understood. It said, "Sleep, little prince, while we prepare your kingdom for its new masters." Then darkness took me, and I knew nothing more until I heard your voice calling me lazy. Mason stared at the prince in alarm. This portal, Does it still exist? Are these creatures still entering our realm? Prince Acheron shook his head. According to my father, royal guards were dispatched to the location I had described before my enchantment. They found nothing. No portal, no creatures, no trace of unusual magic. It was as if the entire incident had never occurred. That seems concerning, Mason said carefully. Indeed, the prince agreed. Which is why, as soon as the physicians declare me fully recovered, I intend to return to the northern forests and investigate personally. Whatever force enchanted me has had 3 years to advance its plans, whatever they may be. Mason nodded, then realized the implication of the prince's words. And as your personal attendant, I would accompany you? The prince smiled slightly. Afraid, Mason Drake? Terrified, Mason admitted readily. But I would go nonetheless. That, said the prince, is why I chose you. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to act despite it. As they resumed their walk, Mason considered the prince's revelation. If some malevolent force had deliberately enchanted the crown prince, that same force might not be pleased to learn that its spell had been broken. The thought sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning breeze. The celebration of Prince Acheron's awakening was a spectacle unlike anything Mason had ever witnessed. For 3 days and nights, the capital city was transformed into a riot of color and sound. Streets were decked with banners of royal blue and silver. Musicians played on every corner, and food and drink flowed freely for all citizens, regardless of species or station. The highlight of the festivities was a grand parade through the city, with the royal family riding in an open carriage drawn by 6 white hippogriffs. Prince Acheron, resplendent in ceremonial armor of burnished silver inlaid with sapphires, waved to the cheering crowds with a smile that betrayed none of the concerns he had shared with Mason. Mason himself rode several paces behind the royal carriage on Starfire, who had made a full recovery and seemed to preen under the attention of the onlookers. As the prince's personal attendant, Mason had been outfitted with new clothing befitting his station, a tunic of deep blue silk embroidered with silver thread, black leggings of the finest wool, and a short cape bearing the royal crest. He felt distinctly uncomfortable in such finery, and even more uncomfortable with the curious or outright hostile stares directed his way by many of the draconian nobles. His appointment had caused quite a stir in court circles, with some viewing it as an insult to draconian tradition and others seeing it as a charming eccentricity on the prince's part. Lady Vespera had warned him to expect such reactions. You represent change, she had told him, and change is rarely welcomed with open arms, particularly by those who benefit most from the status quo. As the parade wound its way through the city streets, Mason noticed a hooded figure watching from the shadow of an alleyway, unnaturally still amid the festive crowd, its face obscured by a deep cowl. When it realized that Mason had spotted it, the figure retreated deeper into the shadows and disappeared. Mason frowned, scanning the crowd for any sign of the strange observer, but it had vanished completely. He debated whether to mention the incident to the guards, but decided against it. The city was full of visitors for the celebration. The hooded figure was likely just a shy onlooker who preferred to avoid the crush of the main crowd. That night, a grand ball was held in the royal palace. As the prince's attendant, Mason was required to be present, though his duties were largely ceremonial. He stood near the prince's chair on the dais, ready to fetch refreshments or deliver messages as needed. The great hall of the palace was a marvel of draconian architecture, with soaring ceilings supported by columns carved to resemble ancient dragons. Crystals embedded in the walls glowed with magical light, bathing the space in a warm, golden radiance. Musicians played on a balcony overlooking the dance floor, their melodies enhanced by subtle sound-shaping spells that allowed them to be heard perfectly in every corner of the vast room. Mason watched with fascination as draconians of every rank and lineage mingled, some in their humanoid forms wearing elaborate gowns and suits, others in half-dragon form displaying scales polished to a brilliant shine for the occasion. A few even retained their full dragon forms, though these were small enough to navigate the hall without causing damage. Mostly ancient nobles too set in their ways to adopt humanoid forms even for social events. Quite the spectacle, is it not? Said a voice at his elbow. Mason turned to find Lady Vespera beside him, resplendent in a gown of deep purple that complemented her amethyst scales. Her white hair was adorned with tiny crystal stars that caught the light with every movement of her head. "It's magnificent," Mason agreed. "I never imagined such splendor existed, even in the royal palace." Lady Vespera smiled, a hint of sadness in her violet eyes. "We Draconians have always had a fondness for beautiful things. Perhaps too much so. We surround ourselves with splendor while sometimes forgetting the simpler virtues." Before Mason could respond to this cryptic statement, a commotion near the entrance to the hall caught their attention. A group of guards was clustered around a figure who appeared to be attempting to enter without an invitation. Prince Ageron noticed the disturbance as well and beckoned to the captain of the guard. After a brief conversation, the prince rose from his seat and approached the entrance, motioning for Mason to follow. As they drew nearer, Mason realized that the uninvited guest was a human woman, slender and tall, with hair the color of ravens' wings and eyes of such a dark brown they appeared almost black. She wore a simple traveling cloak over practical clothing, and her face was set in an expression of grim determination. "Let her approach," the prince commanded the guards, who reluctantly stepped aside. The woman walked forward and dropped into a cursory bow. "Prince Ageron," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Mason could not place. "I apologize for disrupting your celebration, but what I have to say cannot wait." The prince studied her with interest. "You have me at a disadvantage. You know who I am, but I do not know you." "My name is Lyra Nightshade," she replied. "I am a scout for the Human Federation beyond the Eastern Mountains. I have traveled for 30 days without rest to bring you a warning." The prince's expression turned serious. "Speak freely, Lyra Nightshade. What warning do you bring?" The woman glanced around at the crowded hall, clearly uncomfortable with the number of ears that might overhear her message. "Perhaps somewhere more private, Your Highness? What I have to say concerns matters of grave importance to both our peoples." Prince Ageron nodded and gestured toward a small antechamber off the main hall. "We can speak there. Mason, attend us." The three of them withdrew to the antechamber, followed at a discreet distance by two royal guards who took up positions outside the door. Once they were alone, Lyra Nightshade wasted no time on pleasantries. 3 years ago, a darkness began to spread across the lands east of the mountains. Villages disappeared overnight. Strange creatures were sighted in the forests and hills. People spoke of shadows that moved independently of any object casting them. Mason felt a chill at her words, so similar to what Prince Ageron had described encountering before his enchanted sleep. "At first, we believed it to be some natural disturbance," Lyra continued. "Perhaps a shift in magical currents or the awakening of an ancient power. But as our scholars investigated, they discovered something far more sinister. Portals, opening between our world and another, allowing creatures of shadow and nightmare to enter. Precisely what I encountered in the northern forests before my enchantment," the prince said grimly. Lyra nodded. "These portals have been appearing with increasing frequency, always in remote locations at first, but gradually moving closer to populated areas. The creatures that come through them are scouts for something worse, something the ancient texts call the Void Collective." "I am unfamiliar with this term," the prince admitted. "What is this Void Collective?" "A race of beings from a dying universe," Lyra explained. "They seek new worlds to colonize, or rather, to consume. They do not merely inhabit a world. They transform it into a replica of their own decaying realm, draining it of life and magic until nothing remains but shadow." Mason shivered. "And they have been doing this for 3 years while the prince slept?" Lyra turned her dark gaze to him, seeming to truly notice him for the first time. "You must be the stable boy who broke the enchantment. Word of your deed has spread far and wide." Mason blinked in surprise. How could news travel so quickly to lands beyond the eastern mountains? "The breaking of such a powerful enchantment creates ripples in the fabric of magic itself," Lyra said. "Our seers felt it the moment it happened. It gave us hope that perhaps Draconia might yet be an ally in the coming war." "War?" the prince repeated, his golden eyes narrowing. "You believe conflict with these void creatures is inevitable?" "I know it is," Lyra said grimly. The Human Federation has already lost 3 border settlements to their advance. We fight, but conventional weapons are of limited use against beings made partly of shadow and void. Magic is more effective, but few humans possess the innate magical talent that is common among Draconians. Prince Azuron paced the small chamber, his clawed fingers tapping against his thigh as he thought. If what you say is true, why has Draconia seen no sign of these creatures or portals since my enchantment? Our patrols have reported nothing unusual in the northern forests or anywhere else within our borders. That is what concerns me most, Lyra said. By all accounts, the Void Collective surrounds territories before attacking directly. The fact that you have seen nothing suggests one of 2 possibilities. Either they are avoiding Draconia entirely, which seems unlikely given the rich magical resources your kingdom possesses, or they are already here, hidden among us. The prince finished for her. Perhaps my enchantment was not meant merely to remove me as a threat, but to distract the entire kingdom while they infiltrated our society. Mason thought of the hooded figure he had glimpsed during the parade, unnaturally still and watchful. Had that been one of these void creatures? I believe that is precisely what has happened, Lyra confirmed. Your awakening has likely disrupted whatever plans they had in place, which means they will either retreat to regroup or accelerate their timeline. Based on what you know of them, which do you think more likely? The prince asked. Lyra's expression was grim. They do not retreat, Your Highness. They adapt and overcome. I would prepare for an imminent threat. The prince nodded decisively. Mason, find Lady Vespera and my father's war council. Have them meet us in the strategic chamber immediately. Lyra Nightshade, I thank you for bringing this warning to us at great personal risk. The Human Federation has proven itself a true ally this day. Lyra inclined her head in acknowledgement. We stand together or fall separately, Your Highness. The Void Collective cares nothing for the distinctions between human and draconian. To them, we are all simply resources to be consumed. As Mason hurried to carry out the prince's instructions, his mind raced with the implications of what he had just heard. The celebration continuing in the Great Hall seemed suddenly hollow, a facade of normalcy, while an unseen enemy gathered strength in the shadows. Lady Vespera received the summons with a grave expression but no surprise, as if she had been expecting such news. I have felt a disturbance in the magical currents for some time, she told Mason as they walked swiftly through the palace corridors. Something old and hungry watches us from the edges of our awareness. The War Council, comprised of the king, his most trusted generals, and the heads of the various magical orders, assembled quickly in the strategic chamber, a circular room deep within the palace where the walls were lined with maps of Draconia and the surrounding lands. Prince Azuron related Lyra's warning, adding his own experience with the portal in the northern forest. The council members listened in growing concern, some expressing skepticism, but most accepting the grave possibility that Draconia faced a threat unlike any in its long history. If these void creatures can take the form of shadows or disguise themselves as ordinary beings, how are we to identify them? Asked General Draconir, an ancient Draconian whose scales had faded from their original crimson to a dusty rose with age. Lyra, who had been invited to the council meeting at the prince's insistence, stepped forward. They cannot perfectly mimic living beings. There are signs to watch for. They cast shadows even in complete darkness. They avoid direct contact with sources of pure light or strong magic, and they cannot consume normal food or drink. Then we shall test all those who serve in the palace, King Thoraxis declared. Beginning immediately. With respect, Your Majesty, Lyra said, such a direct approach may alert them to our awareness. It might be better to observe quietly and identify as many as possible before taking action. If even one escapes to warn the others, they may accelerate whatever plan they have in motion. The king's eyes narrowed at being contradicted, but after a moment's consideration, he nodded. A wise precaution. We shall proceed with discretion. The council spent the next several hours devising a strategy for identifying potential void infiltrators without raising alarm. Teams of trusted guards and mages would be formed to conduct subtle observations throughout the capital city, looking for the signs Lyra had described. Meanwhile, scouts would be dispatched to the borders to search for signs of portals, or unusual activity. The military would be placed on high alert under the guise of routine training exercises, ready to respond should a direct threat materialize. Throughout the discussion, Mason stood quietly behind the prince's chair, absorbing the strategic planning with keen interest. Despite the gravity of the situation, he couldn't help feeling a certain exhilaration at being privy to matters of such importance, a far cry from his former life mucking out stalls. As the meeting concluded and the council members filed out to begin implementing their assigned tasks, the prince turned to Mason with a thoughtful expression. "You have been very quiet, Mason Drake. What thoughts occupy that curious mind of yours?" Mason hesitated, aware that he was far from an expert in matters of war and magic. "I was thinking about what Lyra said regarding the void creatures avoiding direct light and strong magic. If that is true, then the palace, with its magical illumination and the concentration of powerful mages, would be an uncomfortable or even painful environment for them." A logical conclusion, the prince agreed. Yet the hooded figure I saw during the parade was here, in the heart of the city, surrounded by magical celebrations, Mason continued. "That suggests either incredible resilience or some form of protection against the effects of light and magic." Prince Azuron's eyes sharpened with interest. "You saw one of these creatures during the parade? Why did you not mention this earlier?" Mason flushed with embarrassment. "I did not recognize it as anything unusual at the time, Your Highness. It was merely a hooded observer who seemed to avoid attention. It was only when Lyra described the void creatures that I made the connection." The prince frowned, but nodded in understanding. "Describe this figure in detail." Mason closed his eyes, recalling the brief glimpse he had caught. Tall and unnaturally still, wearing a hooded cloak of dark gray or black. I could not see its face, but when it realized I had noticed it, it retreated into the shadows of an alleyway, and disappeared is the only word I can think of. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. "And you are certain it was watching the parade specifically? Not merely passing by?" the prince pressed. "It was watching you, Your Highness," Mason said with sudden certainty. "Its posture, its stillness, it reminded me of a predator observing potential prey, calculating the moment to strike." The prince exchanged a significant look with Lyra, who had remained behind after the council dispersed. If they are already bold enough to observe royal functions openly, the situation may be more advanced than we feared. "We should inform the king," Mason suggested. "Not yet," the prince decided after a moment's thought. "My father would order an immediate lockdown of the palace and city, which might drive these creatures to desperate action before we are prepared. For now, we will proceed with the council's plan for discreet observation and identification." He turned to Lyra, who had been listening to the exchange with a grave expression. "You have traveled far and must be weary. Quarters will be prepared for you in the east wing of the palace, where you will be comfortable yet close enough to be consulted as needed." Lyra inclined her head in thanks. "I require little comfort, Your Highness, but I appreciate the hospitality. If I may make a suggestion?" The prince nodded permission. "The stable boy, Mason, has demonstrated an unusual ability to notice what others overlook. Perhaps he could be of use in our observation efforts." Prince Azuron considered this, his golden eyes studying Mason thoughtfully. "An excellent idea. Mason has moved between various levels of our society without drawing undue attention. He may notice irregularities that would escape those accustomed to palace life." Mason blinked in surprise. "You want me to spy on your behalf, Your Highness?" "Merely to observe and report anything unusual," the prince clarified. "Your duties as my attendant already take you throughout the palace and grounds. Continue as normal, but with heightened awareness." "As you wish, Your Highness," Mason agreed, though the thought of actively searching for creatures of shadow and void sent a chill down his spine. That night, as Mason prepared the prince's chambers for sleep, turning down the bedclothes, adjusting the magical illumination to a restful glow, ensuring that the morning's attire was ready, he couldn't help glancing repeatedly at the shadows in the corners of the room. Had they moved in ways that shadows should not? Was that merely a trick of the light, or something more sinister? The prince, observing his nervousness with a mixture of amusement and sympathy, said, "You will drive yourself to distraction if you jump at every shadow, Mason Drake." Mason smiled ruefully. I fear you are right, Your Highness. It is difficult not to see threats everywhere now that I know what to look for. Focus on your duties and trust your instincts, the prince advised. You noticed the hooded figure during the parade because something about it struck you as wrong, even before you knew of the Void Collective. That natural perception will serve you better than conscious vigilance. Mason nodded, appreciating the wisdom in the prince's words. Will you be safe tonight, Your Highness? Perhaps additional guards should be posted outside your door. A reasonable precaution, the prince agreed. But I am not as defenseless as I might appear. 3 years of enchanted sleep may have weakened my body, but my magical abilities remain intact. Any shadow creature foolish enough to enter my chambers uninvited would find itself facing considerable opposition. To demonstrate, the prince raised one hand, and a small flame danced across his palm, bright white and more intense than any normal fire. The shadows in the room seemed to retreat from its radiance. Heartfire, the prince explained, a form of magical flame unique to the royal bloodline. It burns brightest against creatures of darkness and void. Mason watched the dancing flame with admiration. It is beautiful, Your Highness, and deadly to our potential enemies, the prince added, closing his hand to extinguish the flame. Now, enough talk of shadows and void. Tomorrow will bring challenges enough without forfeiting rest tonight. Mason bowed and withdrew to his own small chamber adjacent to the prince's rooms, a space far more luxurious than anything he had known in the stables, with a comfortable bed, a writing desk, and even a small bookshelf stocked with volumes from the royal library. Despite his exhaustion, sleep eluded him. His mind kept returning to the hooded figure from the parade, to Lyra's warnings, and to the prince's revelation about his encounter in the northern forest. If the Void Collective had enchanted the prince to remove him as an obstacle, what would they do now that he was awake and aware of their presence? Eventually, Mason rose from his bed and lit a small lamp. He selected a book from the shelf, A History of Draconia's Magical Defenses, and settled at the desk to read, hoping that knowledge might provide some comfort against the unseen threats that now seemed to lurk in every shadow. He was so absorbed in his reading that at first, he did not notice the slight darkening of the room, as if the lamp's glow was being slowly smothered. When he finally looked up, the shadows in the corners of the chamber had grown and deepened, taking on shapes that no natural darkness should form. Mason froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. One shadow in particular seemed to be reaching toward him, extending across the floor like spilled ink, moving against the direction of the light. Fighting back panic, Mason remembered the prince's words about heartfire. He had no such magical ability himself, but the lamp he had lit was enchanted with standard illumination magic. Perhaps it would provide some protection. Moving as calmly as he could manage, Mason picked up the lamp and held it toward the approaching shadow. The light seemed to push the darkness back momentarily, but then the shadow flowed around the pool of illumination, continuing its advance. Mason backed toward the door that connected his chamber to the prince's. He would wake Azuron. Surely the prince's heartfire would banish this unnatural darkness. Before he could reach the door, however, the shadow surged forward with unexpected speed. It flowed up the wall beside him and took form, a hooded figure much like the one he had seen during the parade, but more substantial now, with glowing violet eyes visible beneath the cowl. "The Waker," the figure hissed, its voice like dry leaves rustling in a graveyard. "The one who undid our work." Mason held the lamp higher, trying to keep the creature at bay. "What do you want?" he demanded, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice despite his terror. "To understand," the shadow creature replied. "How did you break our enchantment? What power does a human stable boy possess that could undo the work of the Void Collective?" "I possess no power," Mason said truthfully. "I merely spoke to the prince as one would speak to anyone who had slept too long." The hooded figure tilted its head, an unnaturally fluid motion that reminded Mason of a curious bird, or a snake preparing to strike. "No magic? No ancient artifact? No secret knowledge?" "None," Mason confirmed. The creature made a sound like distant laughter. "Fascinating. The simplicity of it. We calculated every possible magical countermeasure, every ritual of awakening, every potion of restoration. We never considered impertinence." Despite his fear, Mason felt a flicker of pride at having accomplished what all the magical minds of Draconia could not. Perhaps that is why you will ultimately fail, he suggested, edging closer to the prince's door. You understand power, but not people. The shadow creature seemed to consider this. Perhaps, or perhaps we simply need to adjust our strategy. Tell me, Mason Drake, what would you do if you were in our position? How would you conquer a realm like Draconia? The question was so unexpected that Mason hesitated. Was the creature truly asking for his advice on invasion tactics? I would not attempt it at all, he said finally. Draconia's magical defenses are legendary, its armies undefeated in centuries. There are easier targets in this world. True, the creature acknowledged. But Draconia possesses what we need most: concentrated magical energy, accumulated over millennia. The perfect fuel for our transition. Transition, Mason repeated, his curiosity momentarily overcoming his fear. From partial manifestation to full materialization in this reality, the shadow explained. Currently, we exist here as echoes of our true forms. With enough magical energy, we could fully enter your world, bringing our entire collective across the dimensional barrier. A chill ran down Mason's spine at the creature's matter-of-fact description of what would essentially be a full-scale invasion. And once you've transitioned, what then? What happens to Draconia and its people? The shadow's violet eyes gleamed. Some would be consumed, others transformed to serve our needs. The strong might be permitted to exist as tributaries, providing regular offerings of magical energy to sustain us. Not so different from your current hierarchy, merely with new masters. I think the current residents might disagree, Mason said dryly, his hand finding the latch of the prince's door. Undoubtedly, the creature agreed. Change is rarely embraced willingly, but it is inevitable nonetheless. Even now, our agents move through your society, preparing the way. The awakening of the prince is an inconvenience, but not a fatal setback to our plans. Mason's fingers closed around the door latch. Why are you telling me this? Surely revealing your plans to an enemy is unwise. The shadow seemed to smile, though it had no visible mouth. Who would believe the wild tales of a human stable boy? Besides, I find myself curious about you. The unexpected variable in our calculations. Perhaps there is more to humans than we initially assessed. Before Mason could respond, the creature's form began to dissolve, spreading once more into an amorphous shadow. Until we meet again, Mason Drake, it whispered as it flowed beneath the crack of the outer door and disappeared into the corridor beyond. For a long moment, Mason stood frozen, the lamp still clutched in his trembling hand. Had the encounter really happened, or had he fallen asleep at his desk and dreamed the whole thing? The lingering chill in the air and the faint smell of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike, convinced him that the shadow creature had been all too real. Which meant that the Void Collective knew that he had been the one to wake the prince. And worse, they had agents already infiltrated throughout Draconian society. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Mason turned and knocked firmly on the prince's door. Whether the shadow creature believed him or not, he needed to report this encounter immediately. Prince Acheron was awake and alert within moments of Mason's knock, as if he had not been sleeping at all. Perhaps, Mason reflected, after 3 years of enchanted slumber, the prince was in no hurry to return to the world of dreams. Your Highness, Mason began without preamble. One of the void creatures was just in my chamber. The prince's golden eyes widened, then narrowed dangerously. Are you harmed? He demanded, already summoning a globe of heart fire that illuminated the room with brilliant white light. No, Your Highness. It spoke to me rather than attacking. Quickly, Mason related the entire encounter, trying to recall the shadow creature's exact words. When he described how it had questioned him about breaking the enchantment, the prince's expression turned thoughtful. Interesting that they seem genuinely puzzled by your success, he mused. It suggests a blind spot in their understanding of our world and its magic. That could be useful. They said they have agents throughout Draconia, Mason emphasized, preparing for some kind of transition that would allow them to fully enter our world. And they need magical energy to do it, specifically, the concentrated magic of Draconia. The prince paced the chamber, the Heartfire following him like a loyal pet. This confirms what Lyra warned us about. The question now is how many agents they have in place, and how close they are to achieving this transition. The creature seemed confident, Mason said grimly. It called your awakening an inconvenience, but not a fatal setback to their plans. Then we must make it more than an inconvenience, the prince declared. Mason, I want you to bring Lyra Nightshade here immediately. Then alert Lady Vespera and General Draconair. We must accelerate our countermeasures. As Mason hurried to carry out these instructions, he couldn't help glancing at every shadow he passed in the palace corridors. Which ones were merely the absence of light, and which might be watching him with violet eyes, calculating their next move in a game whose rules he barely understood. Lyra Nightshade was not asleep when Mason knocked on her chamber door. She answered immediately, fully dressed and alert, as if she had been expecting his summons. The prince requires your presence, Mason informed her. One of the void creatures made contact. Lyra's expression hardened. They're growing bold. That's not a good sign. As they hurried back toward the prince's chambers, Lyra questioned Mason about the encounter, her focus particularly sharp when he mentioned the creature's reference to a transition. That aligns with what our scholars have discovered, she said grimly. The Void Collective cannot fully materialize in our reality without a massive expenditure of magical energy. They exist here as partial projections, dangerous, but limited compared to their true forms. The creature said that some would be consumed, others transformed, and the strong might be allowed to exist as tributaries, Mason recalled. What did it mean by transformed? Lyra's pace faltered briefly. They can convert living beings into vessels for their consciousness, hollow shells that appear normal but serve as anchors for the void entities. We call them the Taken. Mason felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. How can you identify these Taken? With difficulty, Lyra admitted. They maintain the memories and mannerisms of their original selves. Only subtle signs give them away. An unnatural stillness when they think no one is watching, an aversion to bright light, and most tellingly, their reflection shows their true nature, empty shadows where eyes should be. So anyone in the palace could potentially be one of these Taken, Mason said, the implications sending a chill down his spine. Even those closest to the king and prince. Yes, Lyra confirmed. Which is why we must move carefully. Accusing the wrong person would not only waste precious time, but potentially alert the real infiltrators that we are hunting them. By the time they reached the prince's chambers, Lady Vespera and General Draconair had already arrived. The four of them listened intently as Mason once again recounted his encounter with the shadow creature. This confirms our worst fears, General Draconair growled, his scaled hand resting on the hilt of his sword. These void creatures are not merely scouts or raiders. They intend full-scale invasion. And they've had 3 years to prepare while our attention was focused on the prince's enchantment, Lady Vespera added, her violet eyes troubled. We must assume that key positions throughout the kingdom have already been compromised. Prince Acheron nodded grimly. The question is where and when they plan to enact this transition. Mason, did the creature give any indication of their timeline? Mason shook his head. No specific details, Your Highness. But it spoke with a certainty that suggested their plans are well advanced. We need to identify their focal point, Lyra said. Based on what we've seen in the Human Federation, the transition requires a central nexus, a place where they can concentrate and channel the magical energy they've collected or stolen. The most magically potent location in Draconia is the crystal spire at the heart of the palace, Lady Vespera observed. It has been the center of royal magic for millennia, a conduit for the natural energy flows of the entire realm. General Draconair's eyes widened in alarm. If they were to corrupt the crystal spire, they could potentially tap into every magical ley line in Draconia simultaneously. Then, that is where we must focus our attention, the prince decided. Lady Vespera, I want the spire's protections reviewed and reinforced immediately. General, select your most trusted soldiers to guard the approaches, those whose loyalty is beyond question. And how do we determine that, Your Highness? The general asked. If these Taken retain their original memories and mannerisms, even long-standing loyalty may be compromised. Lyra mentioned that reflections reveal their true nature. Mason interjected. Perhaps a chamber lined with mirrors at the entrance to the spire? Anyone entering would be reflected from multiple angles, making it difficult for a Taken to hide their shadow eyes. Prince Acheron nodded approvingly. An excellent suggestion, Mason. General, see to the arrangements. Lady Vespera, consult with Lyra about any other methods the Human Federation has developed for identifying these creatures. There is one more thing, Your Highness, Lyra said hesitantly. In our experience, the Void Collective always seeks to eliminate those who pose the greatest threat to their plans. Your awakening makes you their primary target. You must be especially vigilant. I am well protected, the prince assured her, summoning a small flame of heart fire to dance across his palm. With respect, Your Highness, they enchanted you once before, Lyra pointed out. They may have other methods beyond direct confrontation. Mason, who had been listening quietly, suddenly remembered something. The creature seemed particularly interested in how I broke the enchantment, as if trying to ensure it couldn't happen again. Perhaps they plan to place you under a different spell, one that cannot be broken by impertinence. The prince smiled slightly at Mason's choice of words, but his eyes remained serious. A valid concern. Lady Vespera, what protections can be established against further enchantment attempts? Several possibilities, Your Highness, the mage replied thoughtfully. Amulets of clarity, potions of magical resistance, wardstones attuned to your personal energy, but the most effective would be a mind guard spell, which creates a barrier around your consciousness that alerts you to any attempt at magical influence. Proceed with all of them, the prince ordered. We cannot be too cautious. As the discussion continued into the night, Mason found himself marveling at how dramatically his life had changed in the span of a few days. From stable boy to prince's attendant to active participant in defending the realm against an otherworldly invasion, it was far more excitement than he had ever anticipated. Yet despite the danger and uncertainty, Mason could not bring himself to wish for a return to his former quiet existence. Here, finally, was a purpose that challenged him, that required all his intelligence and observation skills. Here was a way to make a difference far beyond ensuring that the royal wyverns had clean straw and fresh water. The following days were a blur of activity throughout the palace. Under Prince Acheron's leadership, they identified and captured 12 Void agents, including 3 who had infiltrated the royal council itself. The final confrontation came at midnight during the full moon, when the Void Collective launched their desperate attempt to seize the Crystal Spire. Mason stood alongside Prince Acheron as waves of shadow creatures poured through temporary rifts throughout the palace grounds. They're weakening the barriers between worlds, Lady Vespera shouted as she channeled powerful defensive magic. Mason noticed a pattern in the attacks. They were distractions. Your Highness, they're trying to divert our attention from the Eastern Passage. Trusting Mason's insight without hesitation, Prince Acheron led a small team through hidden corridors to intercept the true threat. There they found the Void Commander, the same entity that had visited Mason, attempting to corrupt the Spire's base with Void Essence. Your transition ends here, Prince Acheron declared, his body transforming for the first time since his awakening into his magnificent dragon form, scales gleaming sapphire blue, wingspan blocking all escape routes. The commander hissed, "Even if you stop me, others will come." "Perhaps," Mason replied, stepping forward with the artifact Lyra had helped him create, a crystal that absorbed and redirected magical energy. "But they'll find this realm better prepared." As Prince Acheron unleashed his heart fire, Mason activated the crystal, creating a feedback loop that turned the Void's own energy against them. The commander shrieked as its form destabilized, and the rifts throughout Draconia began to collapse. "Mason now," Acheron roared. With perfect timing, Mason thrust the crystal into the heart of the Void portal. A blinding flash erupted as the dimensional pathways inverted, pulling every Void entity back to their realm and sealing the connection permanently. When the light faded, the threat was gone. The crystal spire pulsed with renewed energy, its defenses strengthened rather than corrupted. In the aftermath, King Thoraxis held a grand ceremony. "Today we recognize not just victory, but the birth of a new understanding between our peoples, he announced, as humans and Draconians stood together as equals for the first time in history. Prince Acheron appointed Mason as Draconia's first human ambassador to the Human Federation, with Lyris serving as his counterpart. You know, Mason told the prince as they stood on the palace balcony watching celebrations below, when I told you to get up, lazy, I never imagined it would lead to all this. Acheron laughed. Sometimes the simplest words carry the greatest power. Your directness saved not just me, but our entire realm. Mason smiled as Starfire landed beside them, healthy and strong. I suppose even stable boys have their moments. Not a stable boy anymore, the prince corrected. A hero of Draconia. As Mason looked out across the kingdom he'd helped save, he knew that sometimes the most extraordinary changes begin with the most ordinary actions, and that no magic could ever match the power of speaking truth, even to a sleeping dragon prince. And that was the end of the story. If you listened all the way to here, don't forget to leave feedback about what you thought of the story in the comments, whether positive or negative. Your feedback helps us improve. Also leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. And I'll leave here on the screen another video that I'm sure you'll like. Big hug, and see you in the next story.